to the keynote of Stuart Karabenick. It's an absolutely pleasure and honor for me to introduce Stuart to you. I'm even not sure if I have to introduce Stuart because pretty much everybody knows Stuart. I met Stuart in Padua for the first time, I think. And since then, we are in an extremely constructive discussion, not always about research, but also about research. Stuart is currently a research professor in the combined program in education and psychology. He's adjunct professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan, and at the end of the month will become emeritus professor of education of the University of Michigan. Not enough. Furthermore, he is emeritus professor at Eastern Michigan University. His research focuses on students and teacher motivation and self-regulated learning. He has published widely, nationally and internationally in journals. He edited books on the topics including person and classroom influences on student help seeking and cognitive processing in the self-report assessment process. He has been associate editor of Learning and Instruction and series editor of the Advanced Achievement and Motivation series. He has coordinated the EARLI SIG Motivation and Emotion, from which he recently received a Lifetime Achievement Award. Stuart, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Marold. Welcome to the last day of the conference. It's good that you're all together in one place. Actually, if you're looking from this side, it's quite spread out. And I hope you enjoyed your exercises. That's another unique contribution of Marold Wosnitsa to have that, but I think it's not bad. So I'm going to talk about, as you see, about motivation and self-regulated learning. And some of it is speculative. I've never given a talk on this aspect of it before, and mainly introducing what I call strategy motivation, and I'll say some things about information regulation because of the influence of, as you know, of learning analytics in every phase of education. So the topics are a little bit about motivation and self-regulated learning. A lot of you already know this, but I'll talk a little bit about it. Self-regulated learning and outcome-based motivation, which is as you'll see, is a typical way we look at the relationship between motivation and self-regulated learning. And I'll introduce something called strategy-based motivation, which will be the real focus, or the major focus of the talk, of a couple of studies of strategy-based motivation and the combined effects of strategy-based motivation and outcome-based motivation. I'll talk a little bit about how they fit in current models, just 2 or 3 models of self-regulated learning. Say a little bit about the issues of measurement. It's hard to talk about this topic without at least at some point dealing with measurement issues, and there's a lot of controversy about that. And talk a little bit about self-regulated learning and learning analytics, and then a little bit about, as I said, information regulation, and then some implications. So, I mean, there's no question about the influence and attention to self-regulated learning. Been around for quite a few years, but recently has really increased a little bit more. Lots of books and so forth. But one of the early contributions, in addition to work by Barry Zimmerman, is work by Paul Pintrich and Elizabeth de Groot on the skill and the will, which was Paul's major one of Paul's major contributions. A major handbook with Monique Burkhartz and Paul Moshe Zeidner in 2000. And Self-Regulated Learning and Academic Achievement, one of Zimmerman and Dale Shunk's first books. And then major one, putting these together, Motivation and Self-Regulated Learning by Dale Shunk and Barry Zimmerman. And then an international handbook on metacognition and learning technologies by Roger Azevedo and Vince Alvin. And now, one of the latest is a Handbook of Self-Regulation and Learning and Performance, Shunk and Jeff Green, which is really a major contribution to the field and brings together an enormous amount of research and speculation and theory. Highly recommended. It's very well done. Now, these books, except for the Motivations and Self-Regulated Learning book by Shunk and Zimmerman, the books contain some focus on motivation, but they vary. The books vary in how much motivation is included. For example, the handbook, the latest handbook, has a few chapters devoted explicitly to motivation. But if you look at the whole content of the book, it can vary, and in some cases you'll see self-regulated learning, and you won't see anything about motivation, which is, but that's the field. It varies in the extent to which motivation is included. So, let's begin by defining self-regulated learning. These are taken from the usual publications, and this by Paul Pintrich in 2000, an active constructed process where learners set goals for learning, and this is a big part of what I'll call outcome-based motivation, and then attempt to monitor, regulate, and control their cognition, motivation, and behavior, guided and constrained by the goals and the contextual features of the environment. Very standard. Learning that is guided by metacognition, thinking about what's thinking, strategic action, planning, monitoring, and evaluating personal progress against the standard and motivation to learn. And that, of course, I boldface, just again, to bring in the importance of motivation to learn. The cognitive, metacognitive, behavioral, motivational, and emotion, affective aspects of learning. And this is a recent compendium in Frontiers by Panadero. I highly recommend this if you're interested in this area. It's very, very well done. So this is outcome-based motivation. This is usually how you look at motivation and self-regulated learning if you go over the research. So in general, self-regulated learning research and models emphasize that learners set goals for their learning and employ SRL strategies to reach their goals, which can be represented in this way. So you've got motivation that has to do with the outcome that you're trying to reach, and then strategies come in to facilitate the accomplishment of those outcomes, which could be various things like course performance, task completion, and any other outcomes that you can care to name. Okay, the emphasis on here is outcome-based motivation, so please keep that in mind, because I'm going to talk about how we might want to change that. And this is this is the way it looks. So you've got the motivation being directed towards the outcome, and then strategies in between that are really, in a way, mediating or partially mediating. That's a successful accomplishment of those tasks. So, for example, the course is interesting, important to me, and will be useful for my career. Various, in this case, expectancy values. Constructs that are very much featured in this literature. So, typical example of outcome-based motivation research using an expectancy value framework. These are the constructs that you would see, and you can see three of them often combined as value. Okay, and of course cost. And I'll talk a lot about costs, because cost is a major construct. If one is doing something to accomplish a goal, cost, of course, has to be a major component. So this is a course expectancy value example, college students in chemistry, one of the early studies in this area. So you've got efficacy, value, and interest, and how they're correlated with metacognition, elaboration, organization, rehearsal. So the more efficacious you are, the more you value the course, the more you're interested. This interest is separate from value in this case. The more likely you are to engage in these strategies. Again, a very typical way in which self-regulated learning is presented. Okay? It's another one. This is outcome-based motivation, reported strategies. Use ninth grade students in math courses. And here you have a number of different strategies, 7 strategies, and then you have value, efficacy, and cost. I want you to notice something about cost that, as I'll talk about more, I mean, cost you would consider as something that should be inversely related, right, to the use of strategies, but in this case, it's positively related. And you say, why is that the case? Well, that's a good question, and it's not a simple question. But in the case of outcome-based motivation, you often get these positive correlations between cost and the use of strategies, right? So are some aspects of motivation to use strategies missing? My contention is there are, and that's what I'm going to spend most of this talk on. So outcome-based motivation may not capture all the motivational influences on strategy use, suggests the need to include the motivational features of the strategies themselves. For example, some strategies are considered more useful and costly in terms of time and effort than are others. Motivation that derives from the characteristics of strategies and their use will be designated as strategy-based motivation. It's pretty obvious. That's one way to, I think, easily express that. So these are the two kinds of motivation I talk about, outcome-based and strategy-based motivation. So let's look at what that might be in one case. This is, again, one way you could model it. So you've got cognitive strategy motivation should be directly related to the use of cognitive strategies. Metacognitive strategy motivation should be an influence on use of metacognitive strategies, and resource strategy motivation, the use of resource management strategies. There's a whole list of those. One, of course, included help seeking, but there are others as well. Okay? So some questions. How do learners view the relative benefits and costs of using different strategies? How are those appraisals related to strategy use? How is strategy-based motivation related to outcome-based motivation? Are they separate sources? To what extent does strategy-based motivation add to the prediction of strategy use above outcome-based motivation? Okay. Examples recognizing strategy-based motivation in self-regulated learning. This isn't a brand new idea, but it's often buried in the literature, I contend. So here, previous studies of strategy value information. This started quite a while ago, work by Scott Paris and others. Information about the usefulness of a strategy as an aid to performance. Scott Paris and colleagues, Presley and Scott Paris and Richard Newman and McVeigh. And this was done in the 80s, but 1980s. But really, that effort dropped. So it dropped from the literature. Strategy selection depends on perceived effectiveness of strategies. Getz and Palmer, now we're into the 90s. More cost of using newly acquired strategies, which decreases with automaticity. So again, the focus is on a change in cost as a function of time. At least there's a recognition about the influence of costs on the use of strategies. And the use of self-regulatory processes, such as self-questioning during reading, usually requires additional time and effort. So now you've got time and effort costs built in. Deliberate practice may be boring, but those highly motivated may find it enjoyable. So again, the emphasis is on the strategies-based motivation in these, but they're buried in the literature. Strategy use is a function of strategy efficacy beliefs, and here you bring in efficacy by Usher and Harris and Cleary and Kitsantis. So recognizing cost of employing strategies. Self-regulatory process during learning usually require additional time and effort. Here, again, the recognition of cost. Recent reviews of cost components, and this is Baron and Hulleman, Tony Perez, Flake, and Johnson et al. And this is the way they they laid it out. So this is the various, there are more, but these are for the various aspect of cost. So cost is big in the literature, as you would expect it to be. So generally assume, again, that cost is inhibitory and therefore should be inversely related to self-regulatory use. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But we know it. We already know if you look at outcome-based motivation, we know there's evidence that it often is not. Another area of cost is surface and deep strategies. Deep strategies, for example, elaboration, are assumed to be more efficacious as learning tools, but also require more negative effort than do surface or such lower level strategies as memorization and organization. This is, of course, a work by Biggs, and this was also enunciated or part of the Pinchurch and de Groot study. Generally assume that lower level cognitive strategies, for example, rehearsal, are easier to use. This is, again, work by Barry Zimmerman and Anastasia Katsantis, and less costly to use than our higher level strategies in elaboration. So here we have some predictions about the relationship between cost and strategy use. Perceived usefulness and difficulty can influence a shift from memorization to a more difficult strategy. So, however, is cost always inhibitory? And there's something called the instrumentality heuristic, by Lambrou and Kim, a correspondence between instrumentality of a means and feelings of effort. Effort rather than ease may be considered more desirable. And here we get into the issue, another construct that I'm sure you may have seen, and that's the notion of desirable difficulty by Bjork. Expending greater effort can be viewed as more positive due to longer-term benefits. So then cost could now be seen as more positive. And Anastasia Evclidis put it this way: students have two sets of ideas regarding effort and its outcomes. One that effort and persistence are instrumental for success, and one that efforts are hard, has negative side effects, and does not necessarily lead to success. This entails that effort for some students has a utility value, but for others it has costs. So now you've got individual differences, something we'll come back to later. So let's take a study to systematically examine strategy-based motivation and strategy use. This was a study a while ago. Ninth grade U.S., basically ninth U.S. grade students in math classes reported the utility and effort, and this is effort and time, of using the strategies, well, using 7 strategies. And this is what they were. We got 3 cognitive strategies: metacognition and help-seeking. In this case, resource was one of the resource management strategies. Okay, so these are some results, and this is some Bayesian estimate of the relationship, looking at the strategy type and perceived value, right? And we've got surface and deep strategies, and what the prediction would be in this case, that strategies that are surface strategies should be less costly than our deep strategies. So here you have the value of rehearsal. Now rehearsal, you'll notice, is more more positive, actually. Elaboration, less so, and really they are the opposite of what you would predict, right? So now let's look at the relationship between, this is arraying the strategy types, and if you look at the relationship between reported use and utility, you get a nice use is directly related to perceived utilities. This is exactly what you'd predict, right? If you look at the relationship between use and cost, it's slightly, it's really almost negative. It's almost zero, maybe a little bit negative. But I want to emphasize, this is the usual between subjects way of looking at the data. So each data point is really all the subjects put together, and then you've got cost and you've got utility, and then just arrayed across the strategies. So between subjects, typical way of looking at the data. But then there's another way of looking at the data, because all the students give you estimates for each of the strategies. Now you can look at it within subject analysis. Miriam is not here. I don't think he said he couldn't come, but I want to acknowledge that some of this looking at this way, looking at the data is attributable to some work he did prior to this time. So you can examine the relations between strategy-based motivation and use within persons across strategies and Miriam and colleagues. Based on between subjects analysis, expect positive relations between utility and use for most students. Every student has a correlation between perceived utility and use and perceived utility and cost. Right? So that's within subjects. Based on between subjects analysis, expect no relations between utility and use. It's based on between subject analysis, expect no relations between utility and use for most students. That's incorrect. So you would expect, you would expect for most students to be a positive relationship. You can also examine the distribution of utility use and cost use correlations across students. So let's just take a random sample of students and look at the relationship between utility and use. And for most students, you get a positive relationship, which is exactly what you'd expect. Well, in this case, if you look at cost use, for some students, it's direct. And for some students, it's inverse. So if you look at between students, the usual way of looking at the data, you find no relationship. But it looks like it's a combination of students for whom it's a negative relationship and students for whom it's a positive relationship between cost and use. So you put those together, with the usual between subjects analysis, you get virtually no relationship, but if you look at within subjects. So it suggests an important way of looking at the relationship between the characteristics of these strategies and use of the strategies. And it's an important difference. So it suggests an approach to analysis that could be important. Another way is you can take remember every student has a correlation which you can then distribute. And at the beginning of the term, these are the within student utility use distributions. Beginning of the term and end of the term, they're nice J-shaped distributions, which is what you'd expect. The interesting ones are the cost ones. So there's a distribution of the individual cost-use relations for all the students, right? And at the beginning of the term, basically almost a rectangular distribution. So you have some that are positive; those are correlations that you see there that are positive, and you have some students for some students they're negative. There was a change at the end of the term where more of them were negative. But again, there are some students for whom it's positive and for other students for whom it's negative. So again, it's a very important way of looking at these data is to look at both the usual between subjects analysis, but also to look at the distribution of correlations between use and utility and use and cost. A suggestion. And then our strategy and outcome-based motivation related and how. Let's go back to Chris Walters, who made a major contribution to motivation and regulation. And I'll have one quote from Chris. Students who are below some threshold of motivation for a task, and I have inserted that's outcome-based motivation, are not likely to report using regulation of motivation strategies. For these students, the effort needed to enact the strategies, that's strategy-based motivation, may outweigh any desire or willingness they have to complete the task, which is outcome-based motivation. So it's buried in one of Chris's statements in the studies that he's done on motivational regulation. If you haven't read Chris's work on motivation regulation, I highly recommend it. So combined effects on strategy use may vary for different motivational components and different strategies. And Sue Nolan did, I think, the first study looking at the combination of strategy-based motivation and outcome-based motivation. So the outcome-based motivation is, remember, the motivation about the task. And it's, do I like this class? Is it interesting? Is it important? Right? That's in this case, it is done in achievement goal theory. So general task goal orientation. You look at the relationship between general task goal orientation and the use of, in this case, deep processing strategies. That's the typical outcome-based motivation study, right? But then you've got this relationship with the strategy-based motivation. Okay, that's this new way of, or other way of looking at the effect of strategies. And then, of course, you've got a possible mediation, which was true for a lot of strategies. And then you have another mediated relationship between those. One of the first studies to do this. And then it wasn't followed up, but for really since the late 80s. In any consistent way. It was buried in the literature, but nothing systematic. But here's a combination model where you bring these two together. So that's really what I start with in thinking about the combination of outcome and strategy-based motivation. So you've got motivation about the class based on your beliefs about the class and your appraisal, why should I do this? And also you've got the relationship between strategy use that is motivated or influenced by a cognitive strategy motivation, in this case metacognition and resource management. So two sources of motivation and then two influences, as was true in the Nolan study. And research questions. Do outcome-based motivation and strategy-based motivation predict strategy use independently? Does strategy-based motivation account for additional variance predicting the use of strategies beyond outcome-based motivation? For example, motivation to perform well in a class. Does strategy-based motivation mediate relations with strategy use? And again, that's back to Sue Nolan's work. Do these relations depend on motivational components of these two sources? And does it matter which strategy? So strategies may differ. These influences may differ as a function of different strategies. And in this case, I'd like to focus really on expectancy value theory, efficacy, utility, and cost in this study. So this is another EVT study. This is students with a variety of majors. And this is an example item of outcome-based motivation. This is a traditional way in which it's looked at. To what degree do the following statements describe your experiences in this class? The subject matter in this class will be useful for me in the future. A utility, basic utility item. And there's an example of a strategy-based motivation item. What do you believe and how do you feel about the following ways to study and prepare for the exams in this course? And there's a list of them. And one of them is example of rehearsal is practicing the material to myself several times. That's rehearsal, that's memorization. Something I'm good at, efficacy, right? It's useful, utility, and takes up a lot of my time and effort, cost, right? So that's it. That wasn't all of them. That's an example. This is the two kinds of motivation put together in a study. So now you've got relations of these two sources to efficacy. So this is a table that shows the relationship between course efficacy and use. So this is a course, it's outcome-based motivation. And then you have the relation. Now the issue, or the question was, a research question, if we looked at this for strategy-based motivation, would it be the same or different? And as you can see, there's really a different array of relationships. So it suggests that they're different. Strategy and outcome-based motivation are different. And this is the case of efficacy. You can do the same thing for utility. So this is course utility in use, and this is strategy utility in use. I mean, take a look at elaboration, for example. You see different relationships depending on whether you look at the course motivation or look at the strategy motivation. The one that you'll see more of is help-seeking. In the case of course utility and use, it's help-seeking is almost zero correlation. But if you look at the strategy utility and use, it's much more positive. That's utility, right? All right, now this is cost, and this is course cost and use. In this case, you see positive correlation between help-seeking cost and the use of help-seeking. And in the case of strategy cost and use, really different. In addition to which, you can see it much more negatively correlated. So you got this closer relationship, which you should have, between strategy motivation and its consequences than outcome-based motivation. So it depends on what you look at. So you say, what's the answer, folks? Is this relationship between motivation? You say, well, it depends on whether you focus on the course motivation characteristics or the strategy characteristics. Again, adding the importance of looking at the strategy, the characteristics of the strategy relationship. Okay, so now let's look at it another way. This is back to the Sue Nolan way of analyzing the data. So you can look at separate outcome-based motivation and strategy-based motivation separately, right? Or you can put them together and combine them. And you also, when you do that, you can look at the increased variance accounted for by adding strategy motivation to course motivation. So is it something that you should add? Well, I mean, empirically, this is a way to gauge whether the strategy motivation tells us something that outcome-based motivation doesn't. Then you got, again, as in Nolan's work, strategy-based motivation is a mediator as well. And you can look at it separately. So let's go back to those tables that you saw before, the graphs that you saw before, rather, and then just look at this way of looking at those data. So you've got course efficacy related to rehearsal use. Yeah, that figures. And course utility related to rehearsal use, that figures. And now you've got course cost not related to rehearsal, which doesn't. Okay, if that's the case, what do we find with strategy-based motivation? That figures, but now you've got it negative. So you've got a finding with strategy-based motivation that's different from course motivation. So depending on what you look at, you can have different conclusions about the relationship between motivation and use of self-regulation. So it makes a difference. Now, you also have, if they're combined in regression, you can also look at the increased variance accounted for when you combine the two. When you add strategies to course motivation, then, and certainly in the case of utility, there's a lot. These are all significant additions in the variance accounted for, rather. And then you also have a set of mediated relationships. Okay, so this again tells you something that is added by adding strategy-based motivation to course-based motivation. So, and again, increase percent variance accounted for by adding strategy-based motivation. Let's look at monitoring. Again, course efficacy related to reported monitoring use, course utility positively related, and course cost not related and not significantly related. So again, so if you had to conclude what's the relationship between motivation and, in this case, monitoring, you might say, well, no, they're not related. Well, actually, they are. And now you have a negative relationship between monitoring costs and the use of monitoring metacognition. Again, makes a difference which you look at, and does strategy-based motivation add in predicting the use of the strategies? Yes, in each case it is. Even the small 2% is a significant increase in variance accounted for. And even if you include course cost in the regression, you also see that it remains negative. Different answer to the question about relationship between motivation and self-regulated learning. And again, there's mediation in as well. Okay. All right, let's look at help-seeking. Course efficacy and help-seeking use, not related. Course utility and help-seeking use, not related. Course cost, and this is getting back to the difference in the direction of relationship, course cost and help-seeking use, and these data were positively related. So the more costly, I could go on for a while about why this is the case, but don't have the time. Course cost is positively related to help-seeking use. So if you think a course is more positive, at least in this case, there were reports of the greater use of help-seeking as seeking help when people needed it. That's the way it's done, as an intention. Okay, let's go back to help-seeking efficacy. And this is now positive. Again, different answer to the question about the relationship. Efficacy, positive. Utility, positive. Help-seeking is useful. Cost is negative. Different picture of motivation and self-regulation depending on the source of motivation that you focus on. By adding the strategy-based motivation, you have increased variance accounted for in each case, highly significant. Okay? So again, you've got a sense of how these things combine. And again, there's some mediation as well. So, evidence for these two sources of motivation and strategy use, if you had to draw conclusions, outcome-based motivation and strategy-based motivation independently predict strategy use. It depends in some cases. The one could be positive and one could be not, but especially for help-seeking. But the really independent answers to the question, strategy-based motivations accounts for additional variance beyond outcome-based motivation, and that's across all the strategies and all the components of motivation. Strategy-based motivation also mediates relationship between outcome-based motivation and strategy use, and these relations depend on the specific motivational components of outcome-based motivation and strategy-based motivation and the specific strategy. So you have to look at which is the case. Evidence indicates that SBM and utility contributes more than does efficacy and cost for influencing the use of rehearsal monitoring and help-seeking. And this really makes a lot of sense, of course, because utility is major reason why you engage in using self-regulated using strategies. If you think they're useful, then you're more likely to engage in them. So given the evidence, then we may ask about the implications for self-regulated learning models. And I'm just going to, there are 7 current models, major current models, according to Panadero in his review. But I'm just going to pick out 3 because they're very different. The first one is Anastasia Evclides' model of metacognition. And they're two. One is at 2 levels. There's the person level, and then there's the task by person level. And actually, you have to say that in her model, affect and emotion are really, it's like affect and emotion and motivation are really kind of combined. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the two. Anyway, you've got the person level in the model, which is more like outcome-based motivation. And then you've got strategy-based motivation and affect, which is more likely if you can put it somewhere, is more likely in the task and person level. So although motivation and affect are distinct, considerable implications for strategy-based motivation. For example, feelings of difficulty, which she considers a bottom-up influence. Okay, it's back to Paul Pinter's model. So if you look at the way I looked at this model, I said, okay, where's outcome-based motivation explicitly? And we've got target goal setting, which seems reasonable. Goal orientation, adoption as an outcome-based source of motivation. Efficacy judgments of the, and again, this is of the course or the task. And perceptions of task difficulty, task value, and so on. It's about the task one is trying to achieve. But then if you look at the rest of the model, it really isn't there. You don't see the outcome-based aspect of it. You really have more of the of the strategy connection, a strategy motivation connection, although it's not explicit, but you could almost, in a way, add a third dimension to the model, which captures the strategy-based motivation. It's possible. Now we get to another model. Wake up, Phil. So this is Woody and Hadwin, a very famous Copes model. And this is what Panadero said. I didn't say this is Panadero. Only an allusion to motivation in the model. This is Panadero's conclusion. However, Phil Winnie said in 2018, argues it is implicitly captured by traces that reflect motivation in action, which is a different way of thinking or articulating the way that motivation fits in the model. And we could spend several hours discussing this distinction and its importance, but it is one. It's there, but it's implicit in some cases. So strategy-based motivation research contributes to motivational implications, I say, of trace information. All right, something we have to focus on when you do this is measurement issues, which is true in every area of self-regulated learning. And it's been argued about, for example, whether self-report is worth anything. So ways to measure strategy-based motivation as outcome-based motivation are not categorically either valid or not valid. I think that's a statement that has to be made. So if you hear this kind of motivation is invalid, this is valid, you're making a big mistake. Because that's not what validity is. Validity has to do with under what circumstances, for what reasons, and a lot of other aspects. So primary issue is validity. It's the same as the assessment for any other purpose. Whether and under what conditions it provides evidence to support claims. And this is Sam Messick's basic message to the field. It was true a while ago, it's true now. And in this instance, whether it provides information to understand the role of strategy-based motivation in self-regulated learning. So validity in the measurement of SBM is determined by whether a system captures the why as well as the what and when of strategic events. That is the way one should gauge whether a measurement system is valid. All right, what are the options? I won't list them all, but obviously self-report questionnaires, there's a lot of controversy. As here, can contribute important information about strategy-based motivation. This is what was stated by Walters and Wan in the 2018 book I talked about earlier, subject to the issues of granularity. That's the degree of specificity. It's an excellent article by Rovers et al. That looks at granularity as an essential part of looking at relationships between self-report and almost anything else. Because you have a course, you have a pretty broad stroke, right? You've got a course that has a lot of components to it. So if you're looking at the relationship between course motivation and a specific self-regulated learning strategy, you have a mismatch. You got one as a more global, broader category course, and then you've got something very specific. So you've got to be concerned about the match in granularity. And again, I highly recommend the Rovers article is a terrific discussion of that measurement issue. Structured diaries, asking learners, diaries are used in self-regulated learning, but asking learners to provide both strategy use and motivational source when they report would be, in this case, important, because you're looking at why they're doing something as well as whether they did it. Experience sampling, of course, same thing. Diaries, so they get a buzz on their phone and they answer a questionnaire. So not only whether they did something, but the motivational features or the motivational status when they do it would be important. So ESM would be another way of capturing the why as well as the when and what. I think a lot of protocols can also provide information, but subject to obtrusion. And you've got, if you're interested in this, major contributions by Wienman, who's done a tremendous amount of work in looking at different forms of measurement, self-regulation, and motivation. I won't repeat it here, but I think, again, highly recommend Marcel Wienman's work. And also, there's another one called microanalytic approach. This is Bernanke, Jeff Green, Vince Sullivan, et al. And this is a suggested approach which I really like. You collect self-reported information about strategy-based motivation during performance, information about the why as well as the what of strategy use or of other actions. Can be used in computer-based learning environments and a variety of other contexts. Can be applied at different levels of granularity, either single actions or after multiple actions, so it has that capability. And this is one of the ways of illustrating a study, what was done in a study using a microanalytic approach. In this case, it's achievement goal theory. So they're asking whether one did something, and then my goal is in geometry class is to do well compared, is to be well, at least they had it well compared to other students. So that's an achievement goal, performance to do as well is, okay, performance approach, sorry. Yeah. So this is a technique that's very useful. So you've got people doing a task and they're engaging in strategies, and then you stop and ask them. Now, it has all the difficulties of doing that. It could be obtrusive, like any other measure is obtrusive, but you've got some self-report information. It is not perfect, but it's useful information. And then you've got the traces as well. So you got the best of both worlds, but you still have to worry about these issues in measurement. But I think, again, of all the other measures, I think that the microanalytic approach would be useful when you're looking at strategy-based motivation. Okay, now let's consider the complexity of learning for learners in typical contexts. Yeah, okay, this is more like the real world. So you've got students in classes and they're doing all sorts of things, and I mean, they're trying to make sense out of what do I do, and I'm motivated at this, and it changes, and I hate this class now, and all the other issues that come up in the, if you want to call it the real world. So typical student experiences, even in younger grades, but certainly in the college or higher education context. So taking into account the complexity of strategy-based motivation for SRL, the benefits and costs of strategy-based motivation related strategic choices can change with various tasks and classes. Again, things change. They're not stable. And one has to be mindful of that. And with varying task demands, such as deadlines. For example, it's final exam next week, therefore just memorize. Don't forget about the consistency between lectures and course readings, idiot. It's elaboration. I don't have time for elaboration. I have a deadline, and so the strategies I use can change over time. It's pretty reasonable. You've been there. You probably know all about this. I don't have to explain it. Thus, the value of rehearsal in this case can increase compared to other strategies to time pressure. Okay, so how do you look at this? And back to the microanalytic way of looking at it. This is something capturing this, and we'll talk a little bit more about traces. And we can also speculate about the extent that strategy-based motivation hierarchies can be relatively stable in general, or more stable for some students than others. So for some, it can be all over the map. I don't consistently rehearse. I don't memorize. I don't consistently elaborate. How does this relate to this? And this is something that varies across, between students and within. So also the dynamic world of strategy-based motivation as well as outcome-based motivation is challenging and would profit from learning aids to help manage this complexity. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the use of information or information in this context. And now we're more into the learning analytics world, which is huge, and I'll say just a couple of things about it. This could take up a lot more time, truly. But an increase in the amount of information relevant to strategy-based motivation is provided to learners in computer-based learning environments, including cognitive tutors, include GStudy, and other course software, including learning management systems, for example, Canvas, Dashboard, or take your favorite LMS. It's an LA world. And there's so much information out there. And one question you can begin to ask, if you haven't already, is how do I manage this world? And it isn't all. Yeah, social media is a part of that. Who do I talk to, and who do I communicate with? But there's also what information is useful when in the world in which you're trying to accomplish tasks. Especially useful higher ed, learning management systems are used in multiple courses and classes, and you can have all kinds of information in different classes. They also provide dashboards designed to efficiently summarize learning performance as well as information potentially useful for self-regulated learning decisions. This is what dashboards are supposed to do. They're supposed to consolidate information to make it easier for you to figure out what you should do. And in this case, I'm focusing on what strategies you might use given the information that's in a dashboard, which is hopefully making it more efficient than there's other information that you would have to gather in some other way. So dashboards are becoming extremely critical in this world. We can view dashboard, and I will talk about a form of information regulation. So information regulation can be another aspect of self-regulated learning. How do I regulate the amount of information that's out there? So in a way, it's another strategy. And as another strategy, can be more or less useful, but also more or less costly. So do I go to the dashboard or not? Why should I bother? Motivation, self-regulation. If you think of information regulation as a kind of strategy, then there it is. You've got to think about the benefits and costs of doing so. And you really make that decision a lot because of it's what we all do a lot in our daily lives. But in educational context, it can become more critical because you have time constraints, and as I showed that nice little slide earlier, things change all the time, and you're continually making these decisions. So it would be good if this became part of the literature in self-regulated motivation. It's looking at strategy-based motivation in the learning analytics world. Whether and when learners access information, depending on their appraisal of strategy-based motivation, its costs and benefits. As an example, dashboard. I happen to be working with a team of IT people in Michigan, try to come up with what we think is a better dashboard than Canvas has, and it's really an interesting experience. Bringing self-regulation motivation people into this design experience hopefully will result in a better design, but it takes into account aspects of strategy-based motivation and other self-regulatory evidence and theory. So it's recognizing that this information that's being presented has costs and benefits, and try to negotiate which of those makes sense in a design context. So in this case, we're looking at whether you and others have accessed resources. Who's read the assignments? And which ones haven't you read? Assignment planning tool, it shows, this isn't the whole tool, shows when things are due and contribution to their grade. So it has to do with when you plan things. This provides a summary of information for a course that can help you plan. It's planning. Planning, monitoring, regulating is part of metacognition. And then grade distribution includes your current grade and where you are with respect to a distribution. This has resulted in a tremendous amount of discussion about whether you should even present grade distributions. So we're constantly looking at this. Some instructors want to turn it off, and we're even giving students the option of turning it off. Of course, they don't have to look at it, but it turns out they do. And they actually think, even though we don't, if you're an achievement goal theory person, you're hoping that they don't. But it turns out that they do, and in some of our recent work, they seem to like it and find it beneficial. Okay, so adding strategy-based motivations to self-regulated learning. We want students to be more strategic in their learning. Learning to learn books and courses are designed to teach strategic skills that encourage their use. And I will say, in my, and this wasn't exhaustive, but I looked at a lot of those books. You don't find, it's like I couldn't find anything about strategy-based motivation in those books. They tell you how, but they didn't tell you anything about difficulty or cost or benefit, things of that sort. So we also encourage teachers to provide or increase their efforts to incorporate self-regulated learning strategies in their courses along with content. It's a big area. And a lot of preparatory programs, pre-service teaching programs, say nothing about self-regulated learning, although there are some programs that do, but it seems that there are not many. So I believe that such SRL infusion into learning context would be more successful if those efforts incorporated our understanding about students' belief about strategy-based motivation, the benefits and costs of using SRL strategies. And I think if we had this information, we would be better off in our promoting self-regulated learning in the classroom. So we can learn a lot more about self-regulated learning by moving from this SR world to this one. Future research on strategy-based motivation. Research with other motivational frameworks. I concentrated on expectancy value theory, but achievement goal theory and self-determination theory, you'd also want to look at those as well. You could even mix and match. So you could have course motivation as achievement goals, and then you could have strategy-based motivation as expectancy value. So there's nothing that means that they have to be the same framework, but that provides challenges, research challenges, and theoretical challenges, but can be interesting. But it opens that up, because as far as I can tell, there isn't any systematic research in this area. A more extensive study on strategy-based motivation in different subject domains. What's the difference between math and history? We already do this with outcome-based motivation. We look at strategy use in different domains. Changes over time. What about within a course? Well, we often look at it in the research. We measure the strategies, or we look at the traces, but they can change over time. So does the motivation characteristics of the strategies change as well? Does efficacy for using a strategy at the beginning of the course, is it the same at the end of the course? How do those change? We don't know. Influence of outcome-based motivation and strategy-based motivation, and the reverse. So if we captured these data, we can look at use and strategy motivation and see how they relate to each other, and have some inferences at least about the causal relation as an inference between the two. Relations between strategy-based motivation components and equity and cost and over time. Both between, as I said before, and within person analytic approaches would be important. And what about the implications for cooperative learning contexts? An important focus of research that looks at these effort of using strategies in a variety of contexts where students are cooperating. So collaborative. And then looking at strategy-based motivation for oneself, but also maybe inferences about others and what others think, and what do I know about what they do. I know what they maybe do, but now not about the motivation behind it. So you can begin to probe across your cooperating partners, hopefully. But this raises or can raise a lot of questions about the relationship between motivation and strategy use. Thank you very much.
Here we are. Some problems with the technology. Thank you, Stuart, very much for this inspiring talk. I think there are probably some questions somewhere. Why not? You probably don't need a microphone, I think. Do you?
Thank you, Stuart, for this excellent talk. I'm really intrigued by this program of research that you outlined. Right, and the model that you sketched. I would have just one question. It was interesting to see that you subsumed interest. Can you hear me? I mean, yeah. Is the mic working? Yeah. Interest under outcome-based motivation, right? I would tend to disagree. So I would consider, as it's chanted traditionally, interest as an indicator for intrinsic motivation. Or you could say action-based motivation, right? So then the question is, how would you want to incorporate intrinsic motivation in your framework, right? I mean, this is kind of a blind spot, I would say, in most theories of self-regulation and also of self-regulated learning, right? I mean, that start with how, as Paul has done it, with a definition of self-regulated learning targeting a goal, right? And intrinsic motivation is just not targeting a goal. It's about performing an action for its own sake. And it also was interesting to see that you considered utility of specific strategies, but strategies can also be more or less fun, more or less boring and so on. So they do have an intrinsically valuable, positively, negatively component, right? So how would you want to deal with that?
Well, so in picking out these dimensions, I didn't show you everything, of course, but you think about interest. This is interesting because interest at the outcome-based motivation makes a lot of sense. But interest in this at the strategy level, you have to think about: are you interested in memorizing? I'm just thinking about how it might work in a strategy-based motivation world, or that aspect of it. But interest in organizing or interest in elaborating might not be bad. I mean, you could think about interest in that area. Interest is a difficult one, but if you want to raise it to the level of a lot of other emotions, it would be interesting to have a table if you have the strategies and the different emotions, for example. That would be something to look at, and may tell us something that we didn't know before. So that's the best way I can to respond to that. If you want to bring emotion into this framework at all, how would they relate? And that's something that I could look at a little bit, but not very much in these data. This is the first large study I've done. But yeah, you bring up a very important topic. Hey, Phil?
I was awake. Thank you, Stuart, for a lovely talk. And for the label strategy-based motivation. I hadn't conceptualized that nice way to encapsulate things. I'd like to ask you to speculate a little bit about how you might address the notion of strategy-based motivation when you are teaching learners new study tactics and learning strategies. Would there be some kind of staircase progression to focus on the components you mentioned, or that any of the others in all the various models you pick? How do you get learners conceptualizing without rushing to the end and saying, oh, the cost is too much, or I don't know what the utility is, or the efficacy, et cetera?
I would start qualitatively with a more in-depth look at asking students to report on this aspect of strategy use. So how do you feel when you use it? Or things of that sort that elicit these ways in which students think, how students think and feel about the use of those strategies. So I'd begin more broadly, frankly, to get that information, and then do the usual data reduction, and that might then look at this in a more formal way. But I wouldn't begin that way. I would have them self-report at the beginning in a qualitative way. But what I'm trying to do here, obviously, is to open the door for that kind of research at the strategy level. So you look at what they do, you then find out why, at least what they say, with all its faults. And I know believe me, I think I know all the faults of self-report. But I think that would be my answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Somebody else wanted to ask a question. Can't see anybody. Yeah.
Thank you for the really interesting talk. So one thing, it's just sort of a thought, and I wanted to get your reaction to it, but it seems like, for example, the utility of a particular strategy may not be known to a student until after they have a performance episode after using that strategy and they see whether it has worked for them. So have you thought about how the particular values and costs and expectancies for success and everything relate to how those might form in different contexts?
Good question. As I said, things change. Things are dynamic. You generalize from your previous experience, right? That's the way you begin. But if you try that in a course, then that belief, your appraisal of that would likely change. And so I say things change. There are between subject differences, there are between student differences, and they're within student differences. So this is dynamic. So I put up that nice, things are dancing around. Always wanted to do that. Things are dancing around, but it's about looking in a dynamic way, and looking in trace studies, but also looking at the other forms of measurement, like a microanalytic approach or ESM or diaries or whatever, to get at the complexity of this. Of course, this is the challenge that we always have, and looking at things that are static, but also things that are changing. That's what I would do.
Yeah, because just as a quick follow-up, it seems like students, I'm thinking about like in a university course, could become more calibrated to the particular values and costs of particular strategies in that course based on how the particular context of that course. So
yeah. But if you make this, if you bring this up, if you make it more, make people aware of it, and if you treat it seriously and discuss it, I mean, if you have a discussion about this in this way by adding SBM, right? These discussions, people do this with the outcome about the course, at the course level, but rare that you'd have this done at the strategy level. So I think, again, it's something to begin to focus on more seriously, which can have, I believe, can have some benefits in learning because of that. So, yeah.
I'm not sure. Oh, it is on. Yay. Hi.
Hey.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was great.
Thanks.
I'm thinking about, well, I'm in the middle of a project, and I just want to see if you think it's related. So university instructors trying to use kind of active learning. It's in essence, in my mind, inserting these kind of learning strategies into instructional day. I think there's a way in which we can, I think, apply the strategy-based motivation to helping instructors think about ways of motivating their students to engage in these activities. And I don't know if there's any other work on that, but that's how I've been thinking, I don't think we talk about the ways in which we need to motivate our students to do the activities of the class rather than the content level.
Is that, I think, trying to think of what the question is, but...
Oh, well, the question is really, can you make that application? Do you think you can make the application of the model of strategy-based motivation that you're looked into to classroom activities motivation?
I think that, first of all, I think the model is quite generalizable. I think that if you're asking about the model use, it can be, you can look at different parts of it. But as I said in the slide before the last one, it is moving to this, from this very one-dimensional world of self-regulated learning and motivation to this one that really is much, in some ways, is much more complicated when you bring strategy-based motivation into it. It opens up a whole category of analyses, the between-within issue. You got mediation. You've got, and you also, I didn't talk a lot about it, but then there's all the moderators. And you can think of a lot of moderating effects that come into play based on outcome-based motivation. It might moderate strategy use of strategy-based motivation. There's so many things that I began to think about that could be valuable directions for research, which has not been systematically looked at. It isn't in some cases, but not in a systematic way that I think can improve the way we think about self-regulated learning. That's the message. So I don't know if it answers your question, but I can't do any more than that.
Okay. Can I ask? Thank you for interesting presentations. I want to ask the problem of the student skill of the learning strategies. And some students don't have a sufficient skill to use the higher levels learning strategy effectively. I think sometimes some students perceive the high cost because of the lack of the, the sufficient skill for using it. So that I'm thinking that when I'm thinking about the cost, not only the problem, pure cost, but just how much the student have their sufficient skill to use that. So that some students say, oh, I use this, but is this not true that they effectively use or not, right? So those kind of differentiations, so when considering the learning strategy, they can use or just use with limited skills, so poorly used, or they can use with the high skill. So those kind of differentiations are a bit difficult. So for example, using just watching the questionnaire style or something. So I want to know those kind of points, how you think about that.
Well, first of all, I spent a lot of, some major proportion of the talk on cost.
Yeah.
Because cost is huge, right?
Yes.
But it's also, you have to be very careful how you conceptualize and measure perceived cost. Because it varies depending on how you do that. But because it's an activity that's costly, it is intrinsically costly. So you have to at some point, you have to take that into consideration. Is it costly? How costly is it? And it's a cost-benefit trade-off, if you will, right? So cost is intrinsically wound into this process. Do I do this? Do I use the strategies? Do I organize? Do I think about how the lectures relate to the readings? And look at the relations. I let more elaboration. How does it work in planning? And especially monitoring, self-monitoring. How does that come into play? Do I think about? How much do I think about what I know? So I think that just a general statement is you have to look at cost, and the fact that you get different relationships depending on whether you look at the course at the course level, outcome-based motivation, versus strategy level. That's again an example, as I try to emphasize, of the importance of looking at strategy-based motivation. I don't know if I answered your question, but. That's my response.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Another question.
Are there more questions? None? I myself have to reflect a little bit more about what you said before I can ask a smart question. So there's no one.
Okay. Just a kind of follow-up question. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about students' knowledge about strategies. So I think one of the problems in this area is that a lot of students don't actually know what strategies to use. They don't know how to use the strategies, when to use the strategies. So even if we're talking about their perception of cost and efficacy of the strategies, often they're actually based on a range of really knowing about the strategies to knowing very little about them, so they perceive a high cost because they don't know how to use the strategies. So when they use them, they don't use them effectively, and so as a consequence, it doesn't work for them, and then they think that it's not a good strategy because they misused it. And a lot of this, I think, is related to the lack of, I suppose, cultivation of these kinds of skills in the general educational context. There is a tendency to focus primarily on content teaching and not so much on how they may connect to the use of strategies within those different sort of like subject domains and so on. So I wonder if you might just briefly comment on that.
Well, in the SRL world, we keep preaching the importance of knowledge about strategic knowledge, right? As well as conditional knowledge, when you use a strategy. And And we hope that this is more likely to be a part of the curriculum than it is. You know, I mean, sometimes you get, you know, a lot of students get to the university, depending on the university, even universities that I know of that are pretty, if you want to say, high ranking, that have very limited concept of study strategies. It's incredible. So they go to a learning to learn class. Well, for goodness sakes, how did they get there? They've done something right, but finally begin to think in the more pressured environment, as the stakes are raised, the more they may think that they need additional work in identifying, as you said, identifying the strategies, under what conditions are they useful, and so on. So the purpose here is to say, well, if we also focus on the motivational component of that aspect, some of it's actually in those courses that they don't focus on it. If you also include the strategy-based motivation components, I think it can advance instruction in those courses, because I don't think that's done now. I think it isn't in the books, but I don't know about the courses because I haven't looked at all the courses. So, but what you talked about is the lack of knowledge about those strategies. They might actually use them and not even understand that they've used them. But I also think that, as so many others in the SRL world do, it's important that they become more well articulated. So, yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point, and I.
But because a lot of the models are based on students' reports, self-reports.
Yes.
About these strategies.
Yes.
If they have reported their beliefs about these strategies, and those beliefs are actually based on faulty knowledge about these strategies, then I think that may affect the, I suppose, the reality,
right.
the representation of.
Yeah, that's a measurement issue. Well, you have to, in the self-report, you have to make sure they understand what you're asking them.
Yeah.
Right? So you don't ask them, have you elaborated lately?
Yeah.
You infer that from what
they say. Yeah.
Right? Some of them are easy. I mean, memorization is a little easier than elaboration. But this is part of the measurement process, and all the psychometric issues that come into play when you're doing the research. I mean, you bring up a very, very important point, and I don't have the answer to it, but I think that's something that you have to confront when doing this research, and also instructing in strategy skills use and so on.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for one last question, if there's one. But I think there's probably much more time to discuss this inspiring talk after this session. Stuart will be around. Stuart will also be, as far as I know, at the gala dinner tonight. So thank you very much, Stuart, for this inspiring talk. And since we all know that we are burning quite some calories in a talk like that, some sugar for you.
Oh.
So, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for discussing. As usual, coffee and cookies outside.